Good afternoon. I'm Veronika Füchtner. I'm co-director of this Humanities Institute towards a global history of sexual science, together with Doug Haynes. And I'm very pleased to introduce Robert Tobin to you today. He's the Henry Lear Chair in Foreign Languages and Cultures at Clark University. He previously taught at Whitman College, and he received his PhD from Princeton. Tobin is the author of 2 books, Warm Brothers, Queer Theory and the Age of Goethe, and Doctor's Orders, Goethe and Enlightenment Thought. He also co-edited the volume A Song for Europe, Popular Music and Politics in the Eurovision Song Contest. And, he has widely published on Thomas Mann, on Goethe, on the connection of medical history and culture, film, queer theory, the gay rights movement, and sexology. He foremost works on the German language context, but he's one of those rare scholars who also considers a much broader context, including the Latin American and the North American context in his work. He received numerous awards and grants. He was a Rockefeller Fellow in the Program for the Study of Sexuality, Gender, Health, and Human Rights at Columbia University. And he just returned from Vienna, literally a few days ago, where he was the Fulbright Freud Visiting Scholar of Psychoanalysis at the University of Vienna and the Sigmund Freud Museum. In 2009, he organized a fantastic conference, which I was part of, on the occasion of the centennial of Sigmund Freud's visit to Clark University, titled Global Freud, and he edited a special volume of the journal Psychoanalysis and History on this topic. The way in which this conference was conceived, thinking about transnational networks and conversations, became a real model for me, especially in the intellectual enterprise of this institute. Tobin is currently completing a book titled Peripheral Desires, The German Discovery of Sex. And I think he has brought a lot of new archival research together for this book and for this talk. And we look forward to hearing it today. Please help me welcome Robert Tobin.
Thank you so much for the invitation to come here. I'd never been to Hanover, and it's such a beautiful city, and Dartmouth's such a lovely campus. So such a beautiful town, I guess, but it is a lovely place, and I'm very, very happy to be here. I'll jump right into the talk. So I had the opportunity last fall to go to Namibia, which I wanted to do because I knew of a sodomy case that took place in the colonial era down there. And Jim Stakely, who is kind of a founder in, at least in American, German, gay and lesbian history studies, had told me that the files were still down there in Namibia. And what I found completely exceeded my expectations. It was, for me, the first time that I had, despite having thought about paragraph 175, the sodomy laws in Germany, for many, many years, it was the first time I had really followed in an in-depth way a case and really sort of gotten into the mindset of someone who was accused of violating paragraph 175. And so I got a sense of how one argued, how one thought about those cases. And in addition, I felt like I got a much more vivid sense of the polyphony of voices that were going into the construction of sexuality at this time. And you'll hear about those in a second. Now, I had the opportunity yesterday to join in the conversation that was taking place yesterday, and so I was thinking a little bit about the connections between my work and some of the issues that came up there. And so just 3 little points. So I remember someone was talking about a kind of a debate between the emancipatory and the disciplinary sides of sexology. And I think you'll see that the general first line understanding would be is that the sexologists are providing an emancipatory source here, whereby, however, we will also see by the choices that one makes in emancipating oneself, then subsequently discipline oneself. Then you'll also see that although this is called sexology in the Southwest, I think I am very interested in the political and legal and criminological structures that actually allow sexology to provide the emancipatory and disciplinary status that it provides. And then finally, there was quite a bit of discussion about the transcultural moment yesterday, and I think we'll see that I don't primarily read this in a transcultural way. I see this almost more as an internal German discussion. However, we do get voices of Africans in this case that will be mediated, of course, but it is interesting. And so I do hope to provide some kind of initial thoughts on a kind of a racial and post-colonial analysis of this. So let's go right, oh, and there's one more issue. This is actually the first time I'm talking about this in English, and one of the things I think is really interesting are these issues of translation, because it seems to me that particularly sexual vocabulary and sexual criminological vocabulary is very archaic, and it's very eccentric, and so I think we'll have some kind of really interesting discussions about how to translate things that maybe some of you working in other languages will have also, similar debates about going, that you'll have some similar debates going on. And so the German will generally be here. Sometimes I'll rush through it just in the interest of time, but it will always be there for those of us who want to kind of do a closer reading of it. So, okay, what did I find there? Well, I found out it wasn't a sodomy case. Victor Fan Alton was a sort of irrepressible person. So in October of '97, he was accused of indecent conduct contrary to nature, paragraph 175, and acquitted. I actually didn't find that, but I've subsequently found out about that. And then what I found was in '04, he's convicted of paragraph 175, 2 months imprisonment. In '05, he is convicted again, 5 months imprisoned. And then in '06, he's convicted, and they're really sick of him. So what I read was 36 months in prison. That seems to have been shortened, because then in the subsequent documents, they talk about 12 months in prison. Then also in '06, he's expelled from the colony. And then there are 3 more efforts that he has to reopen the case in '08, and in petition to reopen in '08, and then 11. I think there's a 10, I think I'm missing a 10 here also. So in '08 and in 10 and 11, he petitions to reopen 3 times from Germany. And then also in the meantime, this is also something I have not found the data for, but I found referenced somewhere. He actually sues the German Reich for expelling him from the colony, and he loses that suit too. So there's a vast amount of information. We get statements from the plaintiffs, who are African men. We get lots of statements from the accused, Victor Fan Alton. In the end, there are 15 reports from psychiatrists and physicians, 3 from the colony and 12 from Germany. There's a letter from the Scientific Humanitarian Committee, which I had never heard of before. I mean, I'd heard of the committee before. I'd never heard of this letter before. And then there are the decisions of the judges. So there's a huge amount of data going on, and you can see that that's what it looks like. The data is in the files of the National Archives of Namibia, which is like fantastic. It's a great place to study. And then I also went to Swakopmund, where there is the Sam Cohen Bibliothek und Archiv für der Wissenschaftlichen Gesellschaft Swakopmund, which has a little bit more of a nostalgic feel about it. Like, it's a private institution, and people go there to find out about their relatives who were colonists or whatever. And they actually didn't have anything for me, but it was still an interesting place to visit. So, brief review. Many of you might not know much about the German colonial experience. In fact, many Germans I know don't know much about the German colonial experience. It was a short little period. But you can see the bright blue were colonies, basically in the period, not all of them, they don't all start in 1885, but basically we can talk about 1885 to 1915 as the German colonial era. And you can see, let me see if I'm good at this here. We can see here Togo and Cameroon, and then German East Africa, which is now Tanzania. And then this area here, they had a lot of islands, including Samoa, but also many of the islands that were then actually handed over to the United States after the First World War. So Guam, the Marianas, so many of the American Pacific possessions come from the Germans, actually. And then German Southwest Africa down here. So this was German Southwest Africa, 1884. It already becomes a colony. It's one of the very first ones. One of the things that is interesting is that basically it's the same time as these trials are going on is the Herero Wars, which are a very serious genocidal war against African peoples there. There are people who claim that it's actually the predecessor to the Holocaust and so forth. But you know, I won't go into that. But it is a very serious genocidal war, and then at the beginning of the First World War, the South Africans march in and take over. The other thing to think about in terms of German Southwest Africa, it's the only colony where the idea was that there was going to be very large settlements from Germany. The notion was that the terrain was such that it could be like South Africa or Australia or Canada or the United States, that you could actually have large amounts of German settlements going on here. So that was the hope. Windhoek is in the center there, and then some of the cities that we'll be mentioning are up here in the center, and then Swakopmund is here on the coast, just for a little background. Okay. To this day, there is a strong German presence there. It's a very surreal place to visit. And many of the buildings are actually kept up very nicely to deal partly with a very extensive German tourist industry. That's actually one of the reasons I went, was that from Germany it was much cheaper to fly there than it would be from the States. And you can see there's actually the descendants of the colonists are still there and have a very extensive private school system. Okay, now a little bit of information about Victor in the background. Most of this comes from the medical reports. I wasn't able to document a lot of it on my own. But he's born in Pomerania, which is over in eastern Germany, so I actually still don't understand why he has that Dutch last name, the Fan Alton. But anyway, that's where he was born. And by his own account, his first sexual experiences take place when he's 12, and he rides on a boy of roughly the same age, a cousin of his apparently. In 1894, he's expelled from the military, apparently for paragraph 175 related reasons, but there's no case. It's a gentle expulsion, so to speak, and he goes down to the colony. He has a variety of sicknesses: typhoid, gonorrhea, malaria, alcoholism, and at the end, one of the medical reports says he has only 5 teeth left. So. Okay, so now let's start working on the cases, and we'll start with one of the plaintiffs, Gerhardt, who is referred to as the Herero bastard, so this is what they look like, and you can sort of see here, this is where he's saying, Ich bin 20 Jahre alt, getauft in Otjimbingwe gebürtig. So that's what it kind of looks like. And what does he say? Well, he says that last night around 11 p.m., as I was sleeping in my room next to the horse stall, a man came, the freight driver Fan Alton. I was supposed to lie down with my back facing upwards and support myself with my arms. In my confused, sleepy state, I did that. As he sat on my back and rode me, I tried to free myself from him, but wasn't successful because he held me down by force. Van Alten is known and feared by all the natives on account of his unnatural tendencies. So this is the report from Gerhardt. Here's the German. I don't think there's too much that needs to be studied here, but we can always go back to it. So Van Alten then is also called in to testify and says, in general, the event may have taken place in the way that the Herero bastard indicates. And then goes on, however, to make 2 arguments. And this is, they're very clear and very, this is where sort of the sexological stuff goes in. First of all, he demands immediately to be checked up on his mental state. He says, well, this is actually the court report. The accused petitioned to have his mental state examined because his perverse inclination in a drunken state, in part also in a sober state, has such power over him that he is no longer in control of his senses. So here's his demand. And what he tells the officials is, I have a perverse orientation and tend toward indecent conduct contrary to nature. We'll talk about that translation later. I try my utmost, however, to repress this tendency. When drunk, however, my immoral tendency affects me so strongly that I am no longer in complete control of my senses, and I no longer know what I'm doing. On the night in question, I was pretty drunk, but I still remember what happened. And then the second point he makes, so first of all is that he's perverse, has a perverse orientation. And then the second point is that what he did was not indecent conduct contrary to nature. So remember, he claims that he does remember what happened even though he was drunk. I know, however, for certain that my clothes remained buttoned and that the bastard had his pants and shirt on and kept them on. Therefore, it did not come to intercourse-like movements. And we're going to talk about this Beischlaf ähnlich in a second, intercourse-like. So his claim is that A, he couldn't help himself, and B, he didn't do it. So, okay. So now we need to back up a little bit and ask ourselves why he is making this claim. So we'll take just this, this account, which is a legal account on, as you can see, the contribution to the study of the necessity of reforming paragraph 175 from 1901. And there are a number of other ones that are basically fairly similar in their accounts. And what we will see is that Van Alton knew exactly what to argue according to the legal debates going on back in Germany at the time. So Wachenfeld does a very thorough analysis, it's about 100 pages long, of the laws relating to homosexuality in Germany. And it's almost philological what he does. So for instance, this word here, wieder natürlich, which I'm translating as contrary to nature. He has a whole lengthy discussion about, well, what would be natural indecent conduct? Well, that would be, for instance, adultery or premarital sex. That's natural, and that's not forbidden here. What would be unnatural, as opposed to, so unnatürlich, as opposed to wieder natürlich? What would be unnatural? Well, that would be masturbation, say. That's unnatural, but still not prohibited. So there's only certain things that are actually contrary to nature. Or, for instance, he looks at this word zwischen, which means between, and says, you know, that means there's actually no difference between passive and active. There's no difference in terms of age or power structure, he says. There's no difference. Actually, seduction is not accounted for in this, he says. The fact is, it's just between two people. So, you know, both sides are equally guilty. And this is something that he considers naturally in need of reform. Everybody who works on this is just appalled that it only applies to men, and it's just, you know, outrageous that women get to do whatever they want. That's what many of the reformers say. So anyway, so he does a very thorough analysis of paragraph 175, which I will read for you now, just in case some of you don't know about it. This is the clause in the German basic law that, that prohibits sodomy. Indecent conduct contrary to nature that takes place between people of the male sex or between people and animals will be punished by prison. There may also be the loss of civil rights. Now, so we already discussed a little bit some of these things, like what does the wieder natürlich, the contrary to nature, mean? What does the between mean? But of course, the real issue is Unzucht. What is the indecent conduct? And essentially what Wachenfeld argues, and what many other people were increasingly arguing, is that it had to be something like intercourse. It had to be Beischlaf ähnlich. So this is a lovely word that I recommend you teach all of your students. Intercourse-like. But that really doesn't solve the problem, because what is like intercourse? And being a German, he has to think about, he's looking for things, the actions that have an inner existential identity with intercourse. And he concludes that there have to be two criteria. You need the bringing together of genitals. That can be one aspect that makes something like intercourse, or of course the insertion of the sexual organ of one person into the body of the other. So these are the discussions that are going on in terms of what is happening with what constitutes a violation of paragraph 175. So we remember that Victor Fan Alton had said, my clothes were on the whole time. Also, I was just riding him on the back. It was just a little game. Now, the reason why doctors get involved in this is because of another paragraph in the German Basic Law, paragraph 51. And I feel that this paragraph is not discussed nearly enough. And this is the law. Well, I'll read it for you and we can talk about it in a second. So a punishable act is not present if at the time the act took place, the perpetrator was in a state of unconsciousness or pathological disturbance of his mental ability such that the free determination of the will was excluded. So this is the paragraph that actually permits the medical testimony that gets you off of the paragraph 175. It also, Wachenfeld does a very close philological reading of this, so he's looking particularly at this stuff that I'm translating as pathological disturbance of mental ability, krankhafte Störung der Geistestätigkeit. For those of you who know German, you'll see it's not a Krankheit, it's a krankhafte Störung, so it's not a sickness. It's a pathological disturbance. It's not really an insanity defense because it's not Wahnsinn, it's a disturbance of the mental ability. And this is actually important for the sexologists because they can then argue that someone has this disturbance but isn't necessarily insane. And so it ends up having this kind of interesting space. My feeling is, I haven't done enough comparative law, but when I've been looking into this and trying to research paragraph 51, it seems to me that more work probably needs to be done on the precise wording in various national legal codes as to what sort of medical exemptions are allowed, because it seems to me this gives more space to the German doctors than perhaps was available in Great Britain or the United States, and that this could actually be a case for the sort of rise in importance of the German medical authorities on these sexual issues. So that's a little bit of the background here in terms of the legal discussions going on. And it is striking that Victor Fan Alton immediately knows these two things to say in his case. So let's return, and we'll return back to the medical opinions that were issued in the colony. So Dr. Beil gives a nice, short, and friendly report in which he says, after thorough discussions and investigations, I can confirm for Mr. Victor Fan Alton that he is ill with sexual inversion. That was kind of a quick, rough translation, but it's basically he's got a bad case of the sexual inversions. Ein konträrer sexual veranlagter Kranker ist. In the case of the usual satisfaction of a sexual drive, which is sitting on the back of a male individual, his actions are driven by a pathological psychical orientation which excludes the free determination of the will. And that's something I also forgot to mention with this paragraph 51, but it's sort of this lovely Kantian, you have to have a free will. And I wanted to mention that about paragraph 51. If we can just go back, from the limited amount of work I've been doing on this in terms of a comparative approach, it really is in most of the Western legal codes, really sort of around 1800 or a little bit before, that you start getting this kind of concern about intent and about possibility, about different degrees of culpability and responsibility. It's the origin in the English language tradition of people who say things like cold-blooded murder, right? So that would be a murder that you do with, a very clear intentions and no emotion at all, whereas an emotional murder might be something else. And I've been thinking a lot about it because A, I've been thinking about this case, but then B, with the Zimmermann case in Florida, some of you may have remembered that one of the things they had to prove about Zimmermann is that he was working with a depraved mind in order to prove the higher level of murder that they would charge that they were trying to bring. Now, for me and maybe for you, depraved might sound like pathological, but actually it's the other way around. In this case, the notion is that he had evil intent. They had to prove that Zimmermann was not that he was sick, but that he was not sick, and that he had this like evil intent, and they weren't able to do that. And that comes from this same sort of paragraph 51 stuff. Okay, so Bale gives an expert opinion that is helpful for Victor Fan Alton. But in the next case, Dr. Dunchman also testifies in the first case, but this is a more interesting document that comes in the 1906 case. He gives a very lengthy and very thorough account of what he considers to be Van Alton's situation. And if you look here, you see, it's not very easy for you to see here, but this is Konträre Sexualempfindung, contrary sexual feelings, sensations, von Westphal, von Kraft-Ebing are cited there. And we'll go into that too. So he says that with regard to the psychiatric diagnosis made on the basis of these findings, this is doubtless a typical case of contrary sexual sensations, von Westphal, von Kraft-Ebing. So he's very aware of the sexological discussions going on in the homeland. Usually, by the way, I translate the Konträre Sexualempfindung as sexual inversion. I think that's more idiomatic, but here I just wanted you to, it's easier to see the connection. And he denies Victor Fan Alton the protection of paragraph 51. These are all quotes from him. What he does is he says that, that through his analysis, he's determined that Van Alton is actually very sane in a whole range of ways, that he is, for instance, incredibly articulate about his rights. So this is actually used against him. This is saying, you know, he knows, he's apparently very logical in terms of what his rights are. He's also very good with money, allegedly. So therefore, the only option remaining is that we have, in this case, a form of sexual inversion in the sense of von Westphal, von Kraft-Ebing, and others, characterized by the isolated degeneration of the drives in which the intelligence and judgment of the affected are not significantly disturbed. That means while committing the offense, the patient can neither have been in a state of unconsciousness nor afflicted by a pathological disturbance of his mental ability that would exclude his responsibility in terms of the Penal Code. Accordingly, the protection of paragraph 51 of the Penal Code does not apply to him in the opinion of the undersigned. So that's the German, which we can go back to if we like. So the court then concludes that on the one hand, it really was indecent conduct contrary to nature. And he's referring here not just to the testimony that I cited before, but some other cases as well. The accused then climbed on their backs and performed with his erect sexual member intercourse-like thrusts on the bodies of the natives. In the most cases, an ejaculation resulted on the part of the accused. That's a typo there. The sexual member of the accused was at times covered and at other times uncovered. So they're dealing with all these issues of skin-to-skin contact, ejaculation, and are trying to demonstrate that this was, in fact, like intercourse. And then they also say that he is culpable. The accused offered as a second reason for lack of culpability the fact that he suffers from a disturbance of the activity of his will. This claim of the accused can also not be seen as accurate. That doesn't seem idiomatic to me, but so they find that he does not merit the protection of paragraph 51. So Van Alton then gets sent back to the colonies, and then from the colonies he tries 3 times to reopen the case. And he gets very important people to write for him. Now the reopening of the case is not the same as an appeal. You can only do it if you have new evidence. And the new evidence consists consistently of these medical opinions. So by the end, actually, I was sort of in agreement with the court in Windhoek that this wasn't new evidence, this was just more opinions. But anyway, and the court in the home court, the court where the decision was made, gets to decide whether to reopen. So that's why these letters are also down in Windhoek. So one is from Hirschfeld, and there you see it's a four-page letter, and there you see his signature, and we'll read that, what he says. So he writes quite a bit, but I think it's interesting, and so I'll read it to you. On the basis of the extensive experience that I, as a specialized physician, have developed in my work with several thousand homosexually oriented people of both sexes, I summarize my report on Mr. Victor Fan Alton as follows. The sexual inversion from which Fan A without doubt suffers would by itself not suffice to exclude the free determination of his will in the sense of paragraph 51 of the Imperial Penal Code. So the sexologists, they know that they can't get away with saying that every single homosexual can get away with it. Now, as far as I can tell, the letters almost always say that this particular homosexual should be excused, but they always say that there probably are some that should still be convicted. The strength of this drive varies considerably and is often stronger than the normal sexual drive, although it's extraordinarily difficult in concrete cases to say whether the drive as such was repressible. In general, it may be described as controllable. And then here is the underlined part that we saw before. If, however, diseases of the central nervous system that seriously diminish the ability to withstand temptation accompany the sexual abnormality, especially cerebrospinal neurasthenia, I think that's misspelled there, which has been confirmed in this case as an after effect of infectious diseases, then the union of the two moments, the sexual and the nervous condition, establishes a pathological disturbance of mental ability that goes so far that one can say with a probability bordering on certainty that there was in fact an exclusion of the free determination of the will in the sense of paragraph 51 of the Imperial Penal Code. Yes. So you get more of that in a second. So here's the German again, which we can return to. I just mentioned this. This letter is written in 1908. It's right in the middle of the Eulenburg affair, which we can talk about in the Q&A, but some people say it's the first major affair, that it's more important than the Oscar Wilde case, where Hirschfeld is also actually entangled in writing letters and actually is getting in trouble for the letters he's been writing. So it's interesting that he's still writing letters in this African case right in the middle of the controversies about the medical opinions he's giving about the back in Germany. Another one of the 12 letters from Germany is from Ivan Bloch. And I'll try just quickly go through his statement. What's interesting to me is partly that he uses the same terminology. It is an old truth, has a slightly different argument. It is an old truth that such childhood events, this is the 12-year-old event, the event when he was 12, with sexual ramifications take root, fully control the psychical being, and can give occasion to the irresistible impulses to experience them again in identical situations. Herein, and not in the mere deviation of the drive that homosexuality per se represents, lies the pathological aspect of such a state. If there is an additional factual physical inferiority as well, plus the influence of alcohol, doubly calamitous in such cases, and finally a severe tropical illness such as malaria, with all of its shattering effects on body and spirit, on reason and will, all of which was the case with Mr. Fan Alton, precisely at the time of the perpetration of the incriminating acts, then it can be assumed with a probability bordering on certainty, they all use that phrase, that in his case a state of pathological disturbance of mental activity was present which excluded the free determination of his will. So what is striking to me is, again, this connection with the precise language of the legal code and why we need to sort of pay attention to the precise language of the legal code, because that's what's structuring what the doctors are writing. Okay, we can get back to the German. The Scientific Humanitarian Committee sends also a letter, a 4-page letter that is typewritten, as you can see. And it doesn't have such great sentences, so even though I'm like really amazed to have found this letter, I'll just tell you they say that they think it's a legal error because they think it wasn't a violation of 175, because they take a very strict line. They think that really it has to be penetration to be a violation of 175. And then they say, with the 12 medical opinions from such well-known experts, how can you be ignoring this? And then the way I actually got to know about this, and I understand you guys heard about Karshak recently, was the very first time I heard about this was in Karshak's 1911 book. I think basically once it got into the circles of the Scientific Humanitarian Committee, then Karshak also found out about it, and he refers to it also. And he's quite outraged. The expulsion from a German colonial region of a German citizen, the farmer and retired Lieutenant Victor Fan Alton, on account of his homoerotic relations with African natives. And then he refers again to the expulsion of a citizen of the German Empire from a German protectorate in Africa for actions that are completely customary in broad daylight among the black natives, says he. That's what Karschak says. So, and then here's his German. So to kind of start getting to a few of the sort of analytical points then on these facts, I've noticed, first of all, that a lot of what's going on is a debate between the colonies and the fatherland, the homeland. So in Germany, what you keep hearing, all 12 of the experts and also the Scientific Humanitarian Committee are saying, you guys don't know the latest in sexual science. You're out of date. And to which the German court response is again and again, well, look at Dunchman's 7-page letter where he's quoting all these sexologists. So, you know, we really are up to date. And then the Germans keep talking about, you saw that in the Bloch, I think, maybe less in the Hirschfeld, but in the Bloch for sure you saw it, the dangers of the tropics. And, that this poor guy is not only homosexually oriented, but he's like, having to work in these terrible conditions. The legal authorities in Windhoek are having none of that. They're saying, we know how hard it is to be down here, and we know that most of us are not doing these things. So here is an example when one of the rejections of the petitions say, the reports by the local doctors are much more valuable than the subsequent reports, since they are informed by exact knowledge of the climatic situation and conditions of life here. So they don't want to hear the Berliners saying that, this poor guy because of how hot it is down there. And then there's actually quite a bit of evidence on alcohol, and this would be a whole other talk, and it's a bit more speculative, but what I had noticed was in the general anti-colonial discourse in Germany that's going on the left, that actually alcohol is frequently brought up. And there's actually a lot of discussion about how the colonists drink too much and how they're also destroying the local cultures by sending alcohol down there. And so to me, it seems to me that there is the possibility there's a subtext going on when the German doctors keep saying, also he's drinking too much, that this is part of a kind of a subtext of fitting into an of a discourse that's opposed to colonialism. Let me see, I have all these notes here, which gets us into a certain critique of colonialism that is going on. My comparative colonial historian friends tell me that it is the case that the German left was more explicit in its denunciation of colonialism than in France and Great Britain. And this could be completely untrue, but I have heard this. And it is true that people like Babel say really very adamant things about colonialism always being exploitation. And there's some other very moving speeches that are given by the Social Democrats in the Bundesrat about opposing the colonial effort. Down in the Southwest, where they're of course pro-colonial, they talk about this also. And so here's just a brief quote from 1906, where in the local newspaper, where they are denouncing the German Social Democrats, saying they regard all colonialization as an injustice toward the natives, as reprehensible rape and exploitation. This is, I think, going on subtly on the German side, but very, very subtly, as we shall see. And then this is, as I say, taking place in the context of the Herero War, which I mentioned earlier. This is an image of people surviving the war. And then one of the strange things about visiting Namibia now is that all the monuments that the Germans built to themselves are maintained, actually very nicely and are all over the place. So there's a lot of monuments to the Germans that are still there. Let me see, I've slightly lost my trail here, but we'll just, okay. I had something smarter to say about that, but we'll just let that go, and hopefully it'll come up in the discussion. But so there is, I think, a veiled critique of colonialism perhaps going on in some of these medical reports, but it's more confusing it's harder to kind of pull out than you might think, for reasons that I'll get to in a second. Now, as I mentioned, I actually read this primarily as an internal discussion about the colonists arguing with the homeland, about the physicians arguing with the legal people. But it is true that we get some African voices here, however mediated they are. And I just included this little quote here because I'm not sure, but it might be a conceivable gesture of respect. What is crossed out is der Junge, which is the youth or the boy, it could be, and instead is Zeuge, witness. And then down here also, I think des Kindes, the child, and here des Zeugen, the witness. So, and that's actually all through this, that the African witness is changed to witness. We can make of that what we will, but I noticed that detail. And it is very interesting that we are getting these African voices at a time when there is an increased interest in regulating sexuality in the colonies. So specifically in German Southwest Africa, at the time of the Herero War, you have in 2005, mixed marriages are banned. In 2006, the churches are forbidden to carry out the interracial marriages. The churches had actually been arguing against the ban on interracial marriages for the most part. And particularly the churches had been arguing that whatever marriages that they had already sanctified should remain sanctified because they didn't want their authority to be put into question. And the churches had other arguments that they thought it was better for the male colonists to settle down than lead a life of fornication and so forth. And then in 1907, the earlier marriages were actually declared null and void in German Southwest Africa. And then this continues, as you can see, in German East Africa. In 1912, in Samoa, that was very controversial there. I've done a little bit of research on Samoa also, and the situation was different there, and there was actually a fair amount of intermarriage, and there was a whole discourse that maybe the Samoans were actually Aryans, and so it wasn't that bad. And also there was a whole discourse of how beautiful the Samoan women were in particular, and so the colonists actually wanted to marry them, or at least they didn't want to be told they couldn't be allowed to. And then as I mentioned, in Germany itself, these issues, it was not monolithic in Germany, the opinion on this. And so actually within Parliament, there were efforts to recognize the marriage and to overturn the colonial administration's banning of the marriages. So, it is very interesting that this case is taking place at the same time as this discussion. Now, I will say my own reading is that there aren't direct references to that. There is not a direct discussion that I found yet in the files saying the problem is that it's interracial. Instead, in fact, if anything, the problem is that that it's unnatural, that it's unnatural, that it's indecent contact that's contrary to nature, and that in terms of the racial and colonial component, the expulsion is justified in the sense that he's embarrassing the white people. That is the reason to send him out. Now, for those of us who would like to think of Hirschfeld and Karl-Schacht as our heroes in this, they actually don't really play the race card in the way that we might like. So Hirschfeld, who I'm quite sure was part of the opposition to the colonial movement, actually, in this particular case, what he does is says, oh my gosh, this guy's a veteran and he helped us in the colonial effort and he's being treated so badly. So, so there's no kind of critique of the colonialism going on in a direct way. And Karl-Schacht's response is also, this man's a veteran, how dare he be treated so badly? And curiously, it's actually his prosecutors who bring out the racial issue more clearly. So they are pointing out that this is Dunchman, and it's part of his kind of general analysis of Fan Alton's psyche. And he points out that Fan Alton has these fits of rage where he isn't able to control himself. And he says, when, for instance, the freight car stands still, he whips the blacks recklessly, even when he knows that the car simply cannot go forward. Now, Dunschman doesn't seem particularly judgmental of this, and he also seems not to consider it part of a larger pathology, because he says that he thinks Van Alton is sane. But he's the one that is actually bringing out these sort of racial issues in ways that, that Hirschfeld and Karschhak and Bloch do not, and that they're actually probably embarrassed to discuss. So as I say, I myself have been reading this more in terms of this kind of internal German discussion. I think the case is very useful actually as a study of how someone who was accused of violating paragraph 175 actually thought and argued, and it gives us a sense of the kind of level of detail and the granularity of the understanding of sexuality at this time. But there are sort of aspects of the colonial and racial era that clearly are also playing a role here that we can continue in our discussions in just a minute. But some of you may be wondering what happened to Victor Fan Alton. I've lost track of him. However, if you Google Victor Fan Alton, you don't get a lot, but what you do get is a 1922 article from the New York Times, where a certain Victor Fan Alton is finally caught in New York City as a gem theft, and specifically a pennywaiter. And you have to read it more carefully. I forget what, I think a pennywaiter, I forget exactly. They explain what it is in there. And the interesting thing is that this guy had been caught. The interesting thing for me personally is that he had been noted in Seattle, Washington, and it was indicated that I used to work not far from Seattle in Walla Walla, Washington. And then he also had stolen gems in Springfield, Massachusetts, and I now don't work very far from there. And then he was caught in New York City, where my partner lives, and so I'm often in New York City. So I do feel there is some kind of overlap between me and Victor Fan Alton. Now, this Victor Fan Alton says that he's a Swede, but I suppose if you had a certain record back in Germany, you might say that you were a Swede. It is true that the diamond industry was already beginning in Southern Africa at this time, so he might have learned a little bit about diamonds while he was down there. There's nothing about him having only 5 teeth in this article, but you know, maybe he had good dental care. So maybe he left Germany and ended up as a diamond thief. But I think I'll end here and let us have some further discussions then about this case. And I think you guys have a bunch of things probably to help me with, and I'm looking forward to hearing. Yes.
This is a really fascinating case, and the material is really fascinating. And thank you very much for presenting it. My question is really about the way this case was brought to court in the first place. I mean, what's fascinating to me is that here you have Herrero, who actually are the accusers, and bring the case to court. But nothing seems to come up in this case at all about the power differential in a colonial situation between whites and blacks, and the issue of possible rape doesn't seem to appear at all. So it's fascinating to me that you know, on one hand, it comes to court and it's tried and he's convicted various times, but at the same time, the charge, racial differentiation, power, all of these things don't seem to have.
Right. Yes. So the issue of consent plays a certain amount of a role. So Gerhardt, for instance, says, you know, I tried to get away and I couldn't. But it does not seem to matter to the authorities. And I think part of it is that in terms of paragraph 175, consensual or unconsensual wasn't that important, is I think one issue. So in terms of the legal definition, I mean, the final case, I think 225 might actually be a rape charge as well. So in the very final case where he gets anywhere between 12 and 36 months. He's actually convicted on 175, 176, which is minors, and 225, and I think that is coercion. I need to check that again. But in general, it is stunning that that there's very little discussion of the question of consent, and also, as I say, a sort of matter-of-factness about the interracialness, which is intriguing given on the heterosexual side, there is this increasing regulation of marriage and sexual actions. There's also, you get a sort of an image, I mean, just a glimpse of a society that, to me, it feels a little bit like the American West. I mean, so Gerhard and Victor are out drinking 2 nights in a row in a saloon together. So, you know, apparently that's going on, although the war is going on. And then it's the second night that Victor comes in to Gerhard's room, which is by the horse stalls. So there's a kind of as I say, a kind of a frontier quality to the life there that was interesting to me to imagine that was going on. Yeah, I agree. I think it's interesting. Yes.
Well, it's very related to this, but it strikes me that race, you made a point about how this might embarrass the colonial authorities and so on, and it seems to me that that's where race really comes in. This is the second time I've invoked this article today. Ann Stoller on the importance of policing the internal differentiation within whites. It's very, the white community is very central to the way race is being constructed. The fact that mixed marriages are disappearing at this time, checking, being concerned about the behavior of poor whites, and being concerned about the behavior, in this case, of someone who is kind of bringing whites into disrepute, and that might be, might be at the core of what is going on and why the arguments that are coming from Metropole really aren't sticking in the colony. And I think Stoller may at some point also talk about the way in which these regimes, sort of racial regimes, consolidate themselves at different points in different. So it seems it's happening later here than in British India. Samoa seems to be still later.
But only a few years.
It's even a little bit still later, but those lines are being drawn and very important in that to check the behavior of deviant whites of various sorts.
Yes.
What's going on?
Yeah. That's yes. I'll just I'll go on to write it right away.
Well, thank you for your lecture. I have just a question. When Kashmir is right in claiming that it's very common, very distributed among the Herreras or something like that, are there cases, do we know any cases about the application of the 175 to Herreras?
No, not that I found. There are, what I have seen is a discussion going on about whether the German legal code applies to the Herero. There is a discussion like that going on, and generally the answer is no, and so the rights also don't apply. But no, there's no prosecution that I've found yet or have heard of yet. It's always been this more internal prosecution. There is an article out about about 175 case in German East Africa also, and you might have run into that.
And amongst Germans in the colonies, are there any other cases?
The East Africa there seems to have been a circle there of, but they also have African lovers too. Yeah, and then that case doesn't seem to, the files, a lot of them seem to be missing. So, yes.
I want to push you a little bit
Okay,
on the
good.
issue of embarrassment, because it comes up a lot in the literature on German colonialism,
Oh, yeah.
either in the context of sodomy or in the context of genocide, murder,
Right.
and it's always talked about, we repatriate as punishment because of this embarrassment. But I'm wondering what kind of other literature, either primary or secondary, exists on jurisprudence in German colonialism, and sort of what other things were people repatriated for? Because if we only look at these, were people repatriated for other kinds of violence, for just not doing particularly good jobs as colonizers, what other things got you thrown out?
I ran across the case that Victor Fan Alton where he sued the German Reich, is in an article that's generally about repatriation. And I'm thinking that people got expelled, the alcohol-related issues came up, and this was, that article didn't mention anything having to do with same-sex. So I think there were certain very egregious sexual crimes, alcohol, and certain types of theft. It's a good question, and I feel like the article I read didn't answer it in a way that I can give you a nice response. What I can say that is perhaps only sort of distantly related. One of the reasons that the Bundesrat and the politicians back in the metropolis, you're saying, were very skeptical about these restrictions on regulation is that perhaps surprisingly to you, race was not a legal concept actually in the German legal code. And so back at home, they were saying, what do you mean? I mean, this was the new constitution of the empire actually got rid of all regulations pertaining to Jews, for instance. And we don't actually have a system of bylaws that determines who belongs to what race, and the military is now just sort of imposing this without any kind of oversight. And so that strikes me as as interesting. It's not exactly related to the embarrassment question, but it is, I think, related to this metropole colonial question. Yes.
I have a question that tacks on to some of the earlier comments about the anti-miscegenation laws, and particularly Gerhardt as a quote-unquote Herero bastard.
Right,
so
yes.
Was he a mixed race? Was he a product of a
Right.
German man?
Yes. And the father is nowhere to be found, of course. Yeah.
Okay, so in terms of his status, I mean, I immediately, as soon as his name came up, I wrote anti-miscegenation laws, how this all played into it, but how, in terms of his own, clearly there are writings in the files about him as a witness.
Yeah.
What kind of discourses are going on there in terms of how he gets represented as the other person in this couplet?
So yes. So it is very interesting that his mixed raceness is brought out, the term bastard seems to have been used then partly as a kind of meaning mixed race, basically. And some of you may know there's the Rehoboth Baster down in. That's a whole group that is still of some political unit power down there. So so it's very. That is a place where the interplay, the interracial sex is sort of being alluded to, without being heavily commented on. What is emphasized is his Christianity. So that's right away that he's baptized, and he basically seems to be part of the German community. So he seems to not be part of the rebellion, and so when I say part of the German community, it's not like he's welcomed into them, but they seem to be assuming that he's not on the rebellion side, but rather one of the people that is fighting.
Yeah, he really also articulates himself in German, which was not
desired
by the German colonial hours from the case that I read.
Right. So right. And so I say that there are African voices, but they're heavily mediated. So clearly they've interrogated him, and then they have written a statement which he signs. And the most direct quote is when he says that he wants the guy to stop. And that seems to me, he's quoted as saying, and it took me a long time to decipher because it wasn't what I was expecting. He says, Mr., as in Mr., and it took me a long time to figure out what that was. But so he's using a kind of mixed language, it seems to me, and then they're turning it into a Hochdeutsch, and then he signs it. So his is the most thorough case that I was able to find. There are quite a few other. As I said, Victor was sort of a serial committer, so there's a Thomas, for instance, and what I have there are more. They're much harder to read. They seem to be sort of the notes of the interrogator, and they give just sort of the most basic facts. But as I say, it's fairly sparse. I have not yet kind of found a mother lode of like really interesting discourse of how these witnesses are being kind of framed or described, or at least I'm still working on interpreting that. Yes?
Thank you. Fascinating case study. And coming to the issue of the bastard, I think that is often just a term that was tacked on to certain racial categories, like Hottentot bastard was often how Hottentots were referred to. So it might not connote anything to do with this family.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it could just be how that racial relocation exists in literature. And of course, you mentioned the bastards, and they had a connection in the Southwest, so it could be another explanation of the tribal affiliation.
I'm just wondering about the name though, Gerhard, Gerze.
Yeah.
Yeah,
he seems very German, yes. Yeah, he does seem very German, yes.
But I think you're getting a range of questions here started and everyone's picked them up on the visibility of the case and its how it highlighted shame and why it became visible at all. Because this is like kind of holy grail of archival source, and it's a little bit like marital rape. These things didn't exist in the colonies. There's actually no record of them being tried, of court proceedings. But the fact that the case exists at all is utterly remarkable. Why was it that the case was brought? Of course, these kinds of violations or ubiquitous. I'm not convinced by the interracial aspect being kind of problem here. That would have been very, very commonly practiced and not convicted. And so I think that if we come to the heart of the matter when we speak about the homosexuality issue, I think that's what has caused the alarm among the colonizing community. And I'd also be astounded if it was the kind of agency of these Herero that resulted in the case being brought. And they would have been very easily silenced. So I think what we're seeing here are kind of a network of actors who are existing, who were reacting to Fan Alton.
Yes.
And then that his behavior was, he became a kind of a source and like a pressure point for kind of key example of someone who was just going too far, but made it too public. And so he had to react against it. I think the context of the genocide is key here. This is not a community of people who cared about dehumanizing the Herero. I mean, they had a bounty on their heads.
Yes.
So why was it? What constellation of factors came together to bring this case rising to the surface? And I think that you answered it in that it was an issue of homosexuality case as the violation.
So when I went to the Swakopmund archive, and I told the archivist that I was interested. I was sort of vague. I said, it's a sexual crime that took place in 1906, 1905, 6, 7, and 8, and she said, well, that would be nothing for me, nichts for me. But then she brought a bunch of newspapers and stuff. I was looking to see if it was reported in the papers, and I was not able to find it reported in the papers at all. And then she came up to me a little bit later and she said, you know, people here had other things to think about. In 1905, 6, and I was like, well, I'm sure they did. You know, it was an odd remark for an archivist to make, but she's right. You know, there were these other issues going on, and I think that you know, I just was at another conference where there was a whole panel called Sex that doesn't mean anything. And as much as I want this case to mean something, there is part of me that thinks, you know, maybe it's very likely they didn't like Victor Fan Alton. Yeah. It's very likely that they wanted him out of the colony for other reasons. And that this was, and maybe this was part of why they didn't like him, because of this sort of flagrant abuse that was embarrassing to them. But it was very probable that, in fact, as far as the colony was concerned, this was a great way to get rid of him. And that's why suddenly the witnesses, the African witnesses, are suddenly upgraded in dignity and credibility. And then what's interesting is that the press is then to think about the press on the German side, and people like Karl picking it up for very different reasons, because for them it was important, and it was about the you know, about the sodomy laws.
Who is the initial charge?
Yeah. Supposedly Gerhardt. Supposedly Gerhardt goes to calls the police and says, this guy, you know, came into my room and tried to ride me, and yes.
No, but then you could give to this another interpretation. I mean, when it was wild, the labor war, maybe this was somehow a strange, small form of anti-colonial resistance.
On Gerhardt's part.
Yeah, the plaintiffs.
Yeah, yeah, perhaps, yeah. I mean, they're certainly all cooperating with the legal system and working within the legal system. Yeah. Yes?
Was the case widely covered in Germany? I mean, I know you indicated that it seemed to be more press coverage there, but was it widely covered? Is that one of the reasons Van Alton ends up in New York?
Well, we don't know if it's the same one. Yeah. I believe that when he got back to Germany, he starts circulating and going to these very prominent doctors. I have yet to find any newspaper accounts in Germany, but that's just because I haven't. Yes, I don't think he was notorious. I think he was something of a hero within the scientific humanitarian community world. I think they thought this guy is a hero / martyr, which then blunted their anti-colonial instincts insofar as they had it. So, yes?
It seems from the discussions and the evidence that you've shown, a lot of the questions that were already asked here, that it just seems so likely that a very similar case could have taken place in Germany itself. Mm-hmm. The language in which it discussed approximates very closely very similar trials going on in Germany. Yeah. So coming from that, my question would be, so what is the relevance, you think, just agnostically of paragraph 175 to colonial history in particular, if the Heimat Kolonie difference is kind of erased almost in this case? Mm-hmm. And that's what makes it.
Right, yes. That's a good question. My initial reading of this is that it's such a complete and such an extended set of cases that it might be, you know, better than many cases taking place in Germany, simply to show how one argued such a case. And to that extent, then, part of my reading was to say, you know, on one hand, we can actually sort of take the colonial aspect out to a certain extent. On the other hand, you know, yeah, I feel like I'm just repeating the very end of my talk. On the other hand, the presence of these voices and the refusal of what you call the metropole, to sort of the arguments from the metropole to stick in the colony, do seem to sort of highlight some, to open a crack up for some sort of analysis there that I'm just beginning to make. So maybe I'll leave it at that. But I'd be very interested to hear what others have to say on
maybe
that question.
Maybe you could go back to the slide on African voices. And
yeah.
That might be a way of starting.
Yeah.
And how you're reading that particular source. Just
okay.
to sort of pick up from that also.
Yes, way at the beginning there, yeah. Okay. As I say, I think the German is fairly, the only thing is I do like this there's not too many translation problems, but I do like this, in meiner Schlaftrunkenheit tat ich das. That's what I translated as, in my confused, sleepy state, I did that. This is the last sentence. My instinct is to suspect that that is the interrogator is writing that, but it is an interesting claim. What is perhaps also of interest. So this case I've just read about. There's an unpublished paper that someone sent me who had that. And here it was also an African man, a young African man, maybe even a minor, who made the accusation and was not believed. And so that's what the paper is about, is that at that point, Victor Fan Alton had the sort of colonial privilege of just saying, well, this is ridiculous. I would never do that. And so then that leads us again to our thinking that in this period, suddenly, they don't like him anymore. Yes. Mm-hmm.
I was also wondering about the other slide that you showed about the upgrading of
yes.
From child and
yes.
boy to
right.
witness.
Yes.
And I think that's actually interesting, because the other way of reading it would be, I don't know enough about German law,
mm-hmm.
but in the British imperial world, what would have happened is actually a child or a minor accusing someone of, a child and a minor would not be responsible, so his voice would carry more weight in a case like this,
mm-hmm.
rather than an adult.
Yeah.
So what is being read as an upgrading might be actually a defense.
Right, yes, yeah. So here, the junge Ausdruckt.
There was a big discussion in Germany at that time about glaubwürdigkeit means believability of children in their witnesses. Yeah. And maybe it has to do with this.
Yeah, no, right. Certainly, I mean, this is something that I was thinking about when I was in Vienna at the Freud Museum, because this was the whole discussion of whether children actually are particularly unbelievable because they make stuff up, and they're actually even malicious, was a claim that was made. This is, I don't have a good quick answer to give to this, but my thought, it is possible that they are diminishing the youth of these people. Some of the accusers are quite young, actually. Gerhardt is 20, so that even today seems like okay. But there are 14-year-olds and who are also who don't have as much testimony, who are accusing him. That it gets a little bit, one starts wondering about it. That's.
I read that in the opposite way.
Yes.
Because often, the language is infantilizing that it's, African boys,
yes.
men in their 50s.
Yeah.
I think that we're seeing an upgrading.
Yeah.
And that legal authorities and other authorities have decided that, using Robert's language, that this man is irrepressible.
Yes.
And he must be stopped. And so that's why, they give these people witness status rather than, replacing them.
This is actually making me think of another question, so I'll ask it too, and then the question I was going to originally ask. Or maybe it's an observation. It seems to me there's a possibility that there was some sliding as well, that it may not be an either or in terms of how age is working in this moment, but that it may also depend on who the intended audience was and who was reading it or who was present in this particular moment. And in those particular cases, then that would render whatever was said more valuable, perhaps, into those eyes. So whether or not it was for a youth and what that would bring, or whether or not it was to upgrade the testimony of a colonist that may not, or a colonial subject rather, who wouldn't have been taken seriously. The reason that I'm thinking about this is that's what happened in Latin America frequently, is they would play with ages. So a 20-year-old might be considered a minor for certain people, or their testimony might be upgraded and said that they were able to say these things, even if technically they were not free in terms of economic or political rights in this way. And it might be a productive ground to think about. But the other question I was going to ask was, whether or not, you said this was a destination now for tourists, of thinking about the colony more broadly during the time period as a place where people like Van Alton might have been looking to get away and express themselves sexually. That certainly happens in other imperial, contexts, and I wonder if there's any of that there.
Yes, I think there is. I haven't come across a lot of literature on that yet, about German Southwest Africa in particular, but it certainly makes sense in terms of what one hears about colonial history elsewhere, that this was a place you could, shed some of your criminal or near criminal past, and B, actually have a fair amount of freedom that, as we hear from Stoller, and in the German tradition, there's Laura Wildenthal is writing on this too, that gets restricted as time goes on. But I'm sure that's why Van Alton went there. That makes a lot of sense.
Just one other thing about this, and it just occurred to me again with this issue of the age, is that it might be also fruitful to consider some of the stuff that's coming out of the early modern period for the Americas, because there are very similar cases which are being brought before legal authorities in which people who are colonial subjects of color are making charges against Spaniards, or making charges against the Portuguese, and they're often invoking issues that we would read today of race, so that we would be looking at their voices in particular ways, and that might be a fruitful avenue.
That sounds great. When you say early modern, are you talking like 1600s,
1600s, yes.
Really?
16, 1700s.
Yeah.
There's a book, Infamous Desire, that was edited by Pete Siegel.
Okay.
Mentioned several of these.
Yeah. Yeah. I was also told there's a book about Brazil by, is his last name Green?
Yeah, Jim's book is good.
Yes, that apparently also very early importation of sexological data that comes like on the first trips, basically, as soon as it's published.
Right.
Yes.
This might not get us anywhere, but I have to ask out of philological curiosity, so to speak. Can you bring up the slide with the report again? Because I was just wondering, is it the norm that the sheet on which it was written was folded in half, and there seems to be a fold in the middle, unless I was completely mistaken, and only...
This sheet?
No, sorry, the witnesses Gerhardt's report.
Oh, yes.
The report that he signed.
They all look like this, that it's, that yes, for some reason it's only written on the right-hand side, and then corrections go in here.
Oh, okay. So it looks a little bit like a Kanzleibogen in a way, or I only know this from other, archival writings from the 19th century or so. So, and often that indicated that this document was in the hands of many people who, worked on it in a way. So I was just curious about the other column, but yeah. So is there anything in the corrections that would,
let me see. Let's see. This, for instance, I think. Let's see. This isn't it.
because I was just wondering whether that would help us characterize the voice of the witness further and what happened to it.
Yeah. You know, I have on my own computer, I have the photographs. We could possibly look at them. With Gerhardt's, what I thought was interesting is it seemed to me is that we actually do, there's, you know, what seems like a very fine script here of someone who, you know, who can write. And then I don't know what those are, but I'm wondering if that's supposed to be Gerhardt, his initials or something like that. And then Van Alton goes in, and that's what I was looking to see if this was, in at least one case, it's very specifically about the Beischlaf ähnlich. And so there's a correction he makes where he says, and you know, is deswegen dann nicht Beischlaf ähnlich, or something like that. He writes in there, right there, you know, very, very specific. And then that is his handwriting, it seems like, at least his signature down here. But yeah, they all look like that. And then sometimes there are shorter, like small, like half-page things that are written all the way across that are also included in here. And then also sometimes on the left are sort of more penciled documents, as you're saying that a lot of people are looking at this. One of the issues that Van Alton is very concerned about is also the costs. So not only does he want to be not convicted, but he also doesn't want to have to pay the legal costs, and he always loses on that too. And there are always these little kind of calculations on the side of, you know, 2 marks for the photocopying, well, not photocopying, but 2 marks for the paper and all that sort of thing gets written on the side as well. Yes?
I have a question that's related to what Ryan was saying. So what's the status of the colonial peoples in relation to this? I mean, in early modern Latin America, what you find is that actually only the Spaniards can be condemned, not the natives, because this is a crime that is equated with heresy, and the natives are neophytes, so because they're neophytes, they cannot be condemned.
Yeah.
Is there like some kind of claim where here, like the natives would be like for some reason exempted from this crime because they are not superior enough to realize
they don't have sexual morality,
because that may also change the nature of who's declaring and from what point of view and.
I mean, what I found are discussions about, in general, whether the German law should apply to all of the colonial subjects, and if not, then what kind of law should apply. And my understanding is, and this comes a little bit from Isabella Hull's work on the colonial history, that Germany was different from France and England in that basically the administration of the colonies went through the military, and the military reported directly to the Kaiser. And so part of what's going on when the parliament, which I kind of presented in a positive light, as the parliament is like saying, you know, we're concerned about this colonial effort. Part of that, I think, is simply that there's a whole aspect of the government that has no relationship to whatever political process we have in the country. So the German military is the one that's then deciding about what laws should apply to the colonial subjects and which ones should not. And in general, they're saying actually very few laws apply, and instead we just make up new laws. So that's the discussion. Now, those laws, I have not yet found much that is explicitly about sexuality, and hopefully I'll find some. Now, what you get is Karl is one person and 1 or 2 other people in the homosexual rights community who will talk, but in my recollection, not in a very legalistic way. They're being descriptive, anthropological. They're saying this is what goes on and there's this type of tradition and this type of culture. So that's all I found so far. So sorry I don't have a good answer on that, but my sense is, as also in response to Reiner's earlier question, that there don't seem to have been any charges filed on sexual crimes that happened among the colonial subjects amongst themselves. So that's not of interest to the colonial powers. Yes?
I found it really compelling when you showed that the legal code in a way becomes constitutive for how sexological arguments are made, right? It structures sexological arguments. And I'm wondering if it would be productive to look at expert statements, Hirschfeld, for example, in Berlin.
Yes, yeah.
So in those cases, you pointed out the similarities, right, in how we get the people off, basically. But I wonder if there aren't also differences that then matter for the colonial context in these expert statements. And the one, I don't remember, I've read other Hirschfeld statements, but I don't remember it very well, so this is more punch. But if I remember correctly, he actually goes into great detail of thinking about social circumstances of the defendants.
Yeah.
And that seemed to be really lacking here. I mean, I only saw part of it.
Right.
And so there is this defendant in this almost empty, socially empty space, right? This completely new space.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
It seems almost
right.
from the description. So there seems to be a real difference in the way the expert statements are written for each space.
That's very helpful.
And I'm wondering what we can do with that.
Right, yes, that's very helpful. And that's, I'm hoping to also work with Reiner because he's been working on these other expert statements as well, and he may have some advice on that. But what I'm struck by is the constant emphasis on the infectious diseases that he acquired. So it seems much more physiological than sociological in this particular case. That seems to be the argument, as opposed to the colonial, as opposed to any kind of social environment, and that might be that might have to do with Hirschfeld's reluctance to get into the colonial situation of this man, given Hirschfeld's own politics probably on the issue, that he'd rather think about this as a diseased, someone who had some physiological diseases, rather than really think about what he was, doing with the natives. Because he read the Dunchman report. He mentions the Dunchman, so he knows about the blacking out and the whipping the natives.
I mean, that makes me curious. I was wondering about that because Julia's point made me very curious about what the differences are between the metropolitan and the colonial setting, and how these cases would be argued. And it seemed to me that the malaria argument is the one that connects it. Right. And there was, of course, a discourse in the late 19th century about during East Africa about Tropenkoller.
Tropenkoller, right? Yes.
Out,
yes. Yeah.
And are overly abusive.
Right. Yeah. It becomes Tropenkoller. It becomes this sort of excuse for almost anything.
Exactly.
Right? Yes.
So that seemed to be the one thing in the paper that was clearly situated.
Right. Right. And it's interestingly what the colonial doctors say. That's not the reason here. That might work for other things.
That was sort of a fantasy, right? That appears a lot in literature.
Yes.
As a justification. But I also wondered whether Hirschfeld, because he's not, did he actually mention malaria, or he's hedging his bets?
Yes. I think he does at the beginning. He says he gives a report of the general sort of state of health of Fan Alton, and he mentioned. Yes. That he had malaria, gonorrhea. He did not have syphilis. Yes,
that,
yes.
Of course, is also associated with NAPS, but
right,
gonorrhea and nonsense.
Yes.
Okay, so that was the question. And then I just had a comment for you about, you seem to be making an argument about the connection that alcoholism, or this alcoholic behavior would be a veiled argument against.
Yeah, that's very speculative. But
yeah, I'm just saying, I'm thinking, some of the leftist reform-minded Germans at that time were also interconnected with some of the
temperance movement. Yeah.
So for me, that wasn't as convincing as the malaria told me.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. But I think it sort of fits in with that. I think this sort of concern about excessive drinking.
Well, it fits with sexual misconduct too.
Yeah.
In the women's
Yes.
movement at
Right.
home.
Yeah.
So there are certain perversions and excesses and seductions that are
My image here just. Oh, there it is. Oh, sorry.
Yeah. I'm kind of coming back to the law issue and the way various people are drawing in sophisticated way of the law. And it's very interesting the kind of interaction between the law and sexology because things are going both ways. I just wondered, first of all, are there lawyers involved and are these statements actually being a product going through lawyers in some way, specialists who know how to read the law, so that can we really take them as the real voice of any of these individuals?
Yeah.
I guess with Hirschfeld we probably have some proof. We'd probably be able to find out. But so that was one question. And the second question had to do back with the original law when it was first drafted, and to what extent sexology might have informed the notions of what was natural and so on at the moment of its drafting, because you're talking about sexologists drawing upon the law, or the law actually drawing upon it.
Yeah, that's interesting. That is funny, but the lawyers. It seems to me in Windhoek there seems to be a fairly elaborate legal establishment, but I'm not recalling any lawyers actually. People go and they report to the authorities, and then and then there's judges and there's expert witnesses, but I think everyone just goes and speaks directly to the people who are taking the testimony, and they're not represented by lawyers. And then once he's in Germany and collecting the expert opinions from the doctors there, it again seems like he works on his own. There is an almost transparent lawyerly level there. I do recall seeing there'll be a note from a lawyer saying, we are hereby submitting 3 expert opinions in our petition to reopen the case. This constitutes new evidence. And so, but it's very short, and there's not a lot of argument there. So that's very interesting, and of course really different than how it would be now. As you may know, so the legal code is rewritten. Both 175 and 51 is rewritten at the creation of the German Empire, and in the years before that, there's extensive expert work being done on rewriting it, and lots of medical authorities are part of the discussion of 175, for instance, and they actually recommend that it be decriminalized. At the same time as Mexico, I was thinking, but the German politicians decide not to accept that recommendation, on the other hand, they do have this. I haven't found as much on the history of 51, so I don't know. I assume that the same sort of commission was there and thinking about that. 51 gets used not in a lot of cases. It gets used for epilepsy. It gets used for actual madness, for the insanity defense, and then heavily for these sexual crimes.
I'm still actually totally fascinated by the initial case and the court that was brought to. And I'm trying to figure out, and you can help me out with this.
Yes.
Who really makes up this commission or court or whatever that's listening to this case? Are these all people who are related in some way to the military? which will make a big difference given the fact that there are wars going on in terms of how the case is decided. You don't want your soldiers to get involved in with the natives in a sexual way. Right. So this is a good example to provide soldiers who don't have this kind of deviation. So who's really in this court? Is it a military court? Is it a civil court?
I understood that it's a civil court, but again, these are great, very helpful questions. So my understanding is it's a civil court. This Bile fellow, I wasn't able to find out much more about Dunshman, who seems to be so knowledgeable, but Bile is a serious citizen of Windhoek, and he's on a lot of commissions, and he's actually kind of arguing. He seems to be about as liberal maybe as a colonist can be. So he wants more open meetings. He feels the city council meetings should be, the reports should be published in the paper and things like that. So he's on various commissions like that. And so I understood this was a city that Van Alton gets basically called to a court that is for the colonists, not for the military. Now it is, now that you mentioned this is another thing that I should put into this. In addition to the increased concern about interracial marriage, in fact there is a lot of discussion about the rates of syphilis among the army, and that they are, there's too much sex going on. And it's not with German women, so that discussion is going on in the background too. That probably I need to kind of bring into the discussion as well.
Maybe one last question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wanted to ask about the role of knowledge networks around malaria and then also sexology, because it seems like the appeals on the basis of scientific knowledge from the metropole doesn't get much traction.
Right, yeah.
And I'm wondering if that's in part because of the medical establishment in German Southwest Africa is doing their own research and not necessarily, maybe there's a sense of independence there from the metropole, where I think in other cases, at least initially, there's a sense that proper knowledge is constituted in the metropole, and the colonial doctors are the ones who send the raw materials back. And I'm wondering if that's happening in the case of malaria, whereas in the production of tropical medicine, and perhaps in the case of sexology, that is perceived as something specific to the metropole, to Berlin, to an urban space that perhaps has nothing to do, or is perceived as having nothing to do with the colony.
That's very helpful. The colonial experience is short enough that I have not found a lot of publications coming back from Southwest Africa to Germany where you're getting this sort of production of information, but it could be there, and I just haven't found it yet. It certainly does seem like in the colony they are dismissive of the opinions of the arguments coming out of Berlin. And then perhaps related, certainly part of Karl-Schacht's argument and other arguments that are in the colonies is a claim that that really the sickness is back home. It's in the big cities and it's in the slums there, and that really down out in the free open air of German Southwest Africa, it's actually very healthy, and that therefore this claim that that one should have, that being in the colonies is an extenuating circumstance, it should actually go in the opposite direction, is the claim. But that's a helpful discussion, and I'll look into that more. So thank you very much. Yes, thank you all.